states where the minimum wage goes up, Denny's tends to be better off because their customers are making more money, and so they can spend more money at Denny's. So I think... Which side are you on? Which side are you
on? Julia Rock is in the Zoom with us today.
I'm really excited about this. This article was great.
Yes.
I loved everything about it, starting with the title, Fear and Loathing Among the Union Busters. Big Hunter S. Thompson fan myself, so I dug the reference. And it was a pleasant surprise. Like I just happened to be checking my email early in the morning and came across it. Dude, it was one of the first things that came across my inbox that morning.
It was popping on Twitter. Everybody was like, my feed was filled with it for days. People
that's why I count on you, Jacob, to tell me what's popping on Twitter.
This was popping, absolutely popping on Twitter. People like posting screenshots of different parts of the article. It's funny. I feel like I read half the article before I ever actually opened the link because so much of it is good and quotable and like, wow, that's an interesting bit there. That half the article was posted on Twitter, from different people before I ever actually read it. So Julia Rock with The Lever News. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about this piece that you wrote.
I'm so glad to join. Thanks.
So, what was the impetus for the, what made you think about writing about, what is it about? I guess you can explain to the audience what the article was about, and then what made you want to write about it.
Yeah, so this is an article about sort of a seemingly maybe unusual gathering of restaurant executives and basically their lawyers, their corporate lawyers at a hotel in Atlanta, Georgia last October. And they were brought together by the legal arm of the National Restaurant Association, which maybe after the Chamber of Commerce, but on its own terms is probably the most anti-worker lobbying group in America. And it was sort of an especially unusual event because the keynote speech was given by Jennifer Abruzzo, the top enforcer of labor law in the federal government. She's the general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board. So there were certainly some moments of, I guess, class conflict, as you would say, at this gathering. And I wrote about it because it's very rare to have the opportunity to hear, lawyers from Jackson Lewis talk union busting strategy. And sort of that's exactly what I was writing about.
And so, just to underscore, this isn't the main part of your article, but this is some other reporting that kind of came out in parallel. Really some of the gross class antagonism coming from the top. There was a New York Times report about how the National Restaurant Association is using fees from safety certificates that these restaurants make their employees get to fund anti-worker electoral campaigns. Can you explain that? Can you explain some of that reporting for us?
Yeah, so this is just completely crazy. So the National Restaurant Association basically runs these food safety certification classes through this business they run called ServSafe, and workers in many states are required to pay for and take these food safety certification classes to be able to work in restaurants. The National Restaurant Association is using the revenue it collects from workers through ServSafe to lobby against higher wages and paid sick leave for those same workers. It's extremely cynical and evil, and it's not really a common way for a lobbying group to fund itself. Oftentimes they're just funded from fees from their members, which are, corporations, or from big donations from, rich people who hate working people.
Yeah, I almost have to give it to them for being so devious to figure out a way to make the very people they're attacking pay for the attack. And like I was ServSafe certified previously working in the restaurant industry. I know for a fact that there are public school students in Alabama at the K-12, at the high school level, who are receiving these ServSafe certifications through their classes at school, right? Through culinary arts and home ec and things like that. And, you know, you just think about how much money is being funneled into that, you know, even so in this case, you know, we potentially have taxpayers subsidizing this money, which is being used, as you point out, to fight working people who work in the restaurant industry, to prevent unionization, to fight minimum wage increases and other labor laws. So, yeah, I just wanted to chime in with that it's happening all over, and anyone who's ever worked in the restaurant industry is, you know, probably pretty familiar with that ServSafe certification. And now I can't look at them on the walls of these restaurants when I walk in. I look at them and I automatically am now thinking about what is happening behind the scenes with that money.
And so what was the main what were some of the main thrusts, some of the main topics of this conference? What were some of the main points of discussion during these presentations? Which,
by the way, to me, what you described, it sounds like a Legion of Doom meeting.
Yes.
It sounds like the world's greatest supervillains all went to Vegas.
Well, so looming large the entire time is, of course, the fact that baristas at Starbucks stores have won unions at nearly 280 stores in just over the past year. So if you're an executive running a chain restaurant, like, you're thinking about Starbucks. The other thing, of course, sort of in the air was that the entire thing had started with this speech, again, from a labor law enforcer, Jennifer Abruzzo. So on the minds of everyone speaking was, I think, the fact that, you know, workers in restaurants and, of course, across industries in the U.S. are sort of increasingly outspoken, not just about issues that sort of directly, you know, impact their working conditions day to day, like wages and you know, scheduling time off. These are things that workers have been sort of at historic levels in recent years, striking over in the past couple of years, but also sort of broader, you know, social and political issues, or at least this is sort of how the lawyers and restaurant people speaking saw it, that right now the American workforce is a lot more outspoken about social and political issues at work than they had previously been. And I think, you know, it seemed to me, based on what everyone is saying, the reason that they're sort of anxious about that type of speech in the workplace is that, like, as soon as you have workers, you know, talking to one another about political issues, it could lead to them talking to one another about issues like wages, scheduling, paid sick time, and, of course, unions.
And, you know, you mentioned the speech that she gave. You quote her in part saying, "I'm not nickel and diming workers," and then somebody coming up after them saying, quote, "Hang in there, don't despair, it's going to get better from here." Like, you know, the idea that, oh no, you're going to have to obey the law. We're going to try to make it a little bit better for you for the rest of the conference, right? We're going to presumably give you some tips and tricks for, you know, getting around the law, right?
I mean, it's funny because when workers say, you know, during union campaigns or at any point, like, you know, we're forming a union and sort of on the one side there's the worker and then on the other side there's the bosses. The bosses will say, "Oh no, we're a family. It's not like that." And then, of course, you have at this conference, as you point out, this, you know, top executive at Golden Corral, a major restaurant chain, saying, like, okay, you know, on the one side you have labor law and the enforcers of labor law, and then on the other side you have us. Like, they're just spelling it out quite clearly.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and something else that they pointed out that you mentioned in your article is how that you mentioned up at the top as well, is this changing dynamic that the workforce has. And one of the people mentioned in one of their speeches that, Yeah, he was, you said that he was happily recounting how in the old days when he started as, at the bottom, he said, we were doing all this stuff that you're not supposed to as a miner, walking around with big knives and shoving raw sausage into a meat grinder, and we can't do that anymore. And, so like, what was the feeling among the audience about this new, this new workforce that they perceive as being more interested in being, in being respected and not having children work and, having safety standards and things like this?
Well, and yeah, so one sort of relevant piece of information is that the workforce in restaurants, as anyone who's eaten in a restaurant knows, is younger than the workforce in a lot of other sectors. And so tropes about young people and about Gen Z people were sort of constantly being thrown around. But sort of the description of this workforce and this generation of workers is that it's a workforce that wants things to be very easy. There was a quote from a Jackson Lewis lawyer saying they want everything to be light and fluffy. This is sort of the Snowflake generation. And, one thing that was interesting that the speaker you mentioned saying we did all these things we weren't supposed to is he was sort of referencing like how low the wages were when he started out in the restaurant industry. But the wages he referenced are actually higher than the federal minimum wage right now. So it was like, on the one hand, there was this sense that the workforce is very different than it used to be. It wants things to be easy. Things used to be tough in restaurants. Now they're light and fluffy. And yet, thanks to lobbying efforts by the National Restaurant Association, the federal minimum wage, when you account for inflation, is lower than, it was back when these people might have been young people working in restaurants. And the tipped minimum wage, the sub minimum wage of $2.13 an hour that tipped workers make, has not moved in 30 years. So there's both the sense that workers now are softer than they used to be, and yet their wages are much worse than the wages of the generation speaking at this conference were when they might have been working in restaurants.
Exactly. And that goes into, and it's amazing because you point out the fact that the tip minimum wage hasn't changed in 30 years. I worked as a waiter for $2.13 an hour. And I remember being, basically cajoling my boss into giving me $1 an hour raise. And so I was making $3 an hour as a waiter my last year. And I was the only person, this is what he told me, I was the only person in the restaurant to have ever even asked for a raise right at that point. And it's just amazing, the idea that the law is so minimal that these bosses, corporations have to adhere to, and yet they don't do it. They still routinely skirt minimum wage requirements. They skirt overtime requirements and all of this stuff. And so because of this, plaintiffs' attorneys will go after these corporations for wage and hour litigation. And this is another thing that you mentioned in your article, saying that, they caricatured plaintiffs' attorneys as the Dr. Evil from Austin Powers in one of their slides for going after for getting these workers wages that they earned. They had plaintiffs' attorneys caricatured as Dr. Evil in one of their presentations for this.
I mean, I'm so glad you brought this up because it was just, I think, one of the most wild things that happened at the conference. But yeah, basically, this lawyer is saying like, oh, you might be the subject of a wage and hour claim. And why? Because plaintiffs' attorneys are evil and, they're going to be looking for wages that you've stolen from your workers. And, that sort of entire presentation about wage and hour issues, it's exactly the point you're making about how the bar is so low. I mean, $2.13 an hour for the tip minimum wage. And yet so much of the presentation was about periods of time, like 5 or 10 minutes, in which these lawyers are advising the audience on whether or not you can pay your workers, you know, the sub minimum wage, or whether you're going to be on the hook for the regular minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. I mean, they're literally litigating periods of time that are like the difference between a 20 and 30-minute lunch break and whether or not you're going to have to compensate your workers for that time.
And the idea, like, how is it, because it just seems to me that so much of this is just really, really so ghoulish as to, it's difficult to see how you could not get more productivity and more loyalty and, you know, from your employees if you just did right by them. You know, like instead of trying to nickel and dime workers for like, oh, can we get by with only giving them a 20-minute break, or, you know, should we give them a 30-minute break? Like, why not just not only make sure you don't violate the law, but do a little bit better? And if you're just a little bit better, you'll be like in the top tier of restaurants, and it seems like you could attract talent. Like, why is that? Was that ever at any point? Was there ever a presentation on like, oh, you know, here's productivity gains that we got at this restaurant by, you know, treating our workers like people?
No. The short answer is no.
Okay.
The little bit longer answer is that, you know, one thing that did come up that didn't really make it into the article, but a few people mentioned, was it's hard to recruit workers in restaurants right now. And this is true. You know, the jobs, as we've been talking about, they don't pay very well. They can be really brutal. And especially, you know, during COVID, when a lot of, you know, restaurant chains were declining to offer paid sick time, when they were, you know, sort of lobbying against efforts to provide paid sick time to workers, lots of people left the industry. So right now it's challenging, you know, to recruit workers to work, especially in fast food restaurants. And this came up a couple of times in the context of lawyers. And I think it was a McDonald's executive talking about, basically how much political speech to allow in the workplace. And sort of what they were basically saying is like, if you seem to have a slightly more generous policy around, you know, not restricting your workers from being open about their political views, like that might be one way to recruit workers. I didn't hear anybody say, you know, if you offer better wages, you'll be able to recruit workers more easily. I did do some reporting last year on the National Restaurant Association, you know, lobbying against raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour and getting rid of the sub minimum wage. And I did a few stories about how a Denny's executive told investors on an earnings call that actually in states where the minimum wage goes up, Denny's tends to be better off because their customers are making more money and so they can spend more money at Denny's. So I think to your point, like, it can be very good for the bottom line to pay your workers more or treat them better, but that's not often something that these executives seem to want to do.
It's just so bizarre to me because, you know, and this, I think this really kind of puts the light of the idea that, you know, the capitalists are just like rigidly rational and logical and purely profit-seeking machines, because so much of this is about power. I mean, you know, this is outside of the restaurant industry, but down here in Alabama, if the Warrior Met Coal, their miners with the UMWA have been on strike for nearly 2 years now. And in just the first, I think, 15 months, after the first 15 months, the UMWA put out calculations showing that if the mines had been operating at full capacity, which they've not been this whole time. They've had some people cross the picket line and some people come from different areas and work in this mine who hadn't before, but they're not operating at full capacity. They're operating at 20 to 40% or something. If they've been able to operate at full capacity, they'd have been able to put out $1 billion more worth of coal. And, you know, a significant amount more of profit, but they haven't done that because they don't want to give up this control. They don't want to allow the union to win, and they don't want to, so it's in that case, and in so many of these cases with the restaurant industry, it's not just about profit, it's about power, right?
And, this is a remarkable thing I come across all the time reporting on, corporations and corporate lobbying groups, is they will lobby against things that would be better for their bottom lines. If it means handing more powers to an agency that oversees them, if it means, voluntarily recognizing a union, if it means raising wages, it can be empirically true that those things will be better for business and they will still oppose them.
And they even mention, one of the things that they mention in this is one of these union busting attorneys said the number one reason for people going to unions is not money. It never has been. It's always been respect. And so, some of this respect and money aren't exactly totally divergent things, like if you're only paying me $2 an hour, it's difficult for me to, kind of wrap my head around the idea that you respect me, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny to present those things as completely mutually exclusive because they most certainly aren't. And the other thing that was sort of funny about that lawyer, saying unions aren't about money, they're about respect, is she didn't really offer any sort of tactic to prevent unions from forming in workplaces that had anything to do with actually being more respectful towards your workers. So while they don't seem willing to offer more money, it's not even clear that they're willing to offer more respect either.
Right. And I was going to say that same thing, that, they're recognizing some truth there. And Jacob and I have had this experience. You talk to any folks in the labor movement, that's a pretty common thing for folks to say. It's about respect. It's about the way I'm treated on the job. It's about more than just the paycheck. That is, a pretty common sentiment. But at no point, do they ever come up with an idea of, I don't know, what if we were nice to people? What if? What if we gave people time off when they needed it? What if we did these things that maybe don't even really cost a whole lot, but would just, be a nice gesture, make people feel valued, and most, I guess when the union campaign rolls around is when they might throw the pizza party, and that kind of thing, or, bring in balloons or something. But, I think that's pretty remarkable to be able to correctly recognize it and speak it out, in front of the room, but have no offer of how you might accomplish that, of treating people with respect, or responding to that, perceived grievance, even, in their minds, as I'm sure it's perceived, right? They just feel disrespected because they're, sensitive snowflakes or whatever. Okay, well, how are you going to respond to that reality? And it seems it's just raw force and, political lobbying and hoping that there's enough folks who are exploitable to come in and replace the people who leave.
And, so you mentioned that they identify respect as something that is operative in this. And if they're saying respect is operative and it's important, but they're not identifying ways that you can make people show you, or that you can show people that you respect them, making their wage livable, like giving them adequate breaks, time off, or any sort of autonomy in their workplace and in their work, and to stave off union campaigns, which is really kind of the ultimate thing about this, or a big thing. And so, what are some of the ways that this conference said you should, if they're saying respect, but they're not doing these things that workers are talking about? What are their alternatives that they were trying to put forward in this conference to stave off unions?
I would say there were two main points to sort of their union avoidance, as they would say, or union busting, as anyone else would say, proposals. And sort of the first was because of what I had been saying before about the perception of, Gen Z as this more socially engaged or politically active generation. What multiple lawyers sort of suggested was giving workers the opportunity to participate in what might seem to the workers like real opportunities, to talk about social and political issues in the workplace, but to sort of make sure those things were happening in a very controlled way where the employer was setting the terms. So particular suggestions that came up were literally like setting up a sustainability committee for workers to be on, and then letting them like do their sustainability things, and then report back to the rest of the workplace about how great their sustainability efforts were. So
that classic
this
tactic of channel unrest into a meaningless committee.
Yes, exactly. So that was sort of the key point to much of the union avoidance was like give them opportunities to sort of think they have a say in something meaningful, but have it like not be very real. And then sort of the other thing underlying it all was like, don't say anything anti-union and don't make it seem like you're trying to stop the union campaign, because the American public is more pro-union than it has been in a very long time. And so doing explicit union busting, they would say you might end up going viral for something you don't want on social media. Something you say might end up in a news headline. Your workers are going to get mad at you. So don't do anything. Don't say what you're doing is trying to stop the union.
Right. Another, and I think, we're getting close to wrapping up, but I did just want to mention this because this was a really kind of fascinating bit that definitely traveled far on Twitter, and that is all of these people talking about how their kids are into it. The discussion around the children of these union busters being pro-union, in a discussion about how in the news unions are, one of Jackson Lewis's colleagues, are saying, who's reading this stuff? My kids. I have an 18-year-old. My kids are into it. And there was another section where this union buster says that their kid came up to them with an opportunity to do like a show and tell thing, kind of like
speak to the class.
Yeah, like speak to the class. And you would be great, Mom, because you're a great public speaker, but you're a union buster, so you can't do it. And so she says like, I don't union bust. I focus on positive employee relations. So I mean, she can't even speak candidly to her children, and that's like fascinating.
I mean, no, that's really mind blowing. Sort of both that she would sort of admit it and the audience would laugh. Like, are you all having sort of similar experiences with your children? Is that why you're all laughing? But yeah, sort of the fact that like you would be presented at home, with shame from your kids about what your profession is. And instead of being like maybe deeply ashamed about that, you would just sort of try to pull the same tactics on them as you are to this, annoying Gen Z workforce you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
I don't like to pathologize politics very much, but I can't help but wonder if some of the sentiments they were expressing about Gen Z and millennials was a reflection of perhaps some of their own strained relationships with their own children and grandchildren who won't call them anymore because they do evil shit for a living. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. I'm not Freud or anything, but that's just my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is. I just found that super fascinating because, like, how is it that you have a child that you have, been in part, talking about your work with, presumably, and why would you not just why would you not just say like, yeah, I'm a union buster. Unions are bad. Like, why I don't know. It's bonkers to me that you can't even be candid with your own family about what it is that you do. I think that is really, that's almost, it seems to me, indicative of some amount of shame that they can't even admit to their family what it is that they're doing. It's pretty wild.
And I honestly think people who lie constantly as a profession. Can't turn that off.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's part of why you see, you know, so many politicians with personal scandals and things like that is because people who are pathological liars and who lie, you know, as a means of survival, they you know, they're not going to just turn that on and turn that off easily.
Right.
Perhaps some can, but not all the time and not forever.
Yeah. So, Julia, we really appreciate you taking the
Absolutely.
time. Where can people find your work and talk to us about The Lever and what y'all are doing over there?
Yeah, the Lever is just a great investigative news publication that everyone should be reading. We cover all things labor, politics, corporations, climate. We're at levernews.com, and we're funded by our readers. So a lot of publications now are funded by billionaires or big foundations or corporate advertisements, but we're funded by the people who read us. So we really need subscribers. Subscriptions are pretty cheap. I think it's $5 to $8 a month right now, and you can find us at levernews.com or at levernews on Twitter. I'd really encourage everyone to subscribe. We rely on you all to keep doing stories like this.
Julia, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is great.
You've got
Thanks so
a
much.
subscriber from me for sure. So,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
all right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
All right.
I second that. I also subscribe to The Lever, and I'm very glad they put out a citizen's guide to like investigative journalism, which I found really cool to just engage people on, like, you know, what is it that investigative reporters do to kind of arrive at the truth and hold people accountable in government. And yeah, I like that. I like the idea of getting your readers involved and kind of training them up on how to go do these things and ask these questions and look for certain documents and do that research. So yeah, I'm glad I subscribed. I'm glad I ran across the article. Really appreciate it. So the link is in the chat. If you have not read Julia's article, definitely check it out.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.